July 26, 1944. Hebreven, Normandy, France. 0640 hours. General Fritz Bayerlein pressed his binoculars so hard into his eye sockets that the metal left red rings in his skin. He had commanded armor across North Africa. He had ridden with Rommel across 600 miles of desert. He had survived Stalingrad's shadow, watched armies collapse, and personally overseen the destruction of 3 Soviet armored brigades in a single afternoon. He understood war the way a surgeon understands a body. Every nerve, every artery, every point where pressure causes collapse. What he was watching right now made no sense. Below him, across the broken hedgerow country of the Norman countryside, a company of American infantry was advancing. That was not unusual. What was unusual, what was almost physically wrong, was the way they were moving. No runner had appeared between squads. No radio crackle had preceded the movement. No officer had raised a hand, blown a whistle, or fired a signal flare. One moment, the left squad was stationary behind a stone wall. Then, without a visible command, without a sound, without anything Bayerlein could categorize as an order, 3 men rose, moved 30 meters left, and disappeared into a ditch. 4 seconds later, a different group on the right pushed forward through a gap in the hedgerow that Bayerlein's men had not yet covered. They were reacting to each other, anticipating each other, moving like water finding the lowest point in a landscape, not pushed, not commanded, but flowing. Bayerlein lowered his binoculars. Around him, his staff officers were watching the same thing with the same expression. One of them, Major Karl Heinzbaum, his intelligence officer, muttered something quietly under his breath. Bayerlein caught only 2 words. "Oui, Munglik." How is this possible? Remember that question. It is going to echo across the next 17 months of the war, and it is going to be asked not by frightened privates, but by the finest military minds Germany had ever produced. Because what Bayerlein was watching was not a trick. It was not luck. It was not even, strictly speaking, American. It was something far older and far stranger. It was a doctrine that Germany itself had written a century earlier, then slowly, fatally abandoned. And the Americans were using it without knowing what it was called. How were they doing it? Why couldn't the Germans follow or stop it? The answer starts 74 years before that morning in Normandy, and it ends in a way that will make you question everything you think you know about what discipline actually means. Here is the question that sits at the heart of this video. How were American infantry units coordinating complex, multi-directional attacks in real time, without visible signals, without radio orders, without officers directing each movement? This is the question German after-action reports kept circling without ever fully answering. It is the question that appears in interrogation transcripts, in captured Wehrmacht intelligence assessments, in the private diaries of general officers who had no framework to explain what they were seeing. This is the question that history books have never quite asked directly, because the answer is uncomfortable. Because the answer reveals that the side that invented the doctrine of decentralized command was losing to the side that had accidentally reinvented it. Because the answer tells us something about human beings under pressure that no military manual has ever fully captured. What you are about to hear is not the story they tell at staff colleges. It is the story behind the story, and it starts in Prussia in 1866, with a general named Moltke and a defeat that changed everything. Prussia, summer 1866. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder was 65 years old, thin as wire, and largely unknown outside the Prussian military bureaucracy when he was handed the problem that would define the next century of warfare. He had been given an army that could not communicate fast enough to fight. This was not a metaphor. It was a logistical fact. In the mid-19th century, armies moved faster than their own command structures. The telegraph existed, but battlefields were not wired. A commander at headquarters might issue an order that would take 40 minutes to reach a brigade commander, who would then need another 20 minutes to relay it to his regiment, which would need another 15 minutes to act, by which time the battlefield had changed entirely. The order would arrive not as useful intelligence, but as a relic. A message from a world that no longer existed. Moltke's solution was radical. Perhaps the most radical military idea of the modern era. He called it Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. The concept was deceptively simple. Do not tell your subordinate commanders how to accomplish a goal. Tell them only what the goal is and why it matters. Then trust them to figure out the how themselves in real time with the information they have on the ground. Information that a general at headquarters could never possess. Instead of orders that said, at 0600, advance to the tree line, hold until Company B arrives on your left flank, then pivot right along the creek bed, Moltke's orders said, seize the high ground. Prevent the enemy from reinforcing. Do what is necessary. The results were staggering. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, and then spectacularly in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Prussian junior officers made decisions, real, consequential, battle-shaping decisions that their French counterparts waited for permission to even consider. Moltke's army did not just move faster, it thought faster. It processed the battlefield faster. It adapted while the French army was still drafting requests for clarification. By 1871, France had surrendered. By 1888, Auftragstaktik was the bedrock of German military doctrine. It was taught in every officer academy. It was written into every field manual. A generation of German officers absorbed it so completely that it became instinct. At the time, no one in the small, underfunded, professionally dubious United States Army paid much attention to it. America had just finished tearing itself apart in a civil war. It had no major foreign enemies. Military doctrine was not a priority, but here is what no one saw coming. The principle Moltke built: trust your subordinates, give them the goal, not the method, let initiative flow downward, was not just a military technique. It was a description of how certain human beings, under certain conditions, naturally organize themselves. It was, without anyone naming it, a description of something deeply embedded in the culture of a nation that had been built, from its very first settlements, on the radical idea that individuals could solve problems without waiting for authority to solve them first. No one in 1870 made that connection. No one needed to. In 1944, on a broken hedgerow outside a small Norman town, it would become the most important military mystery of the 20th century. June 9, 1944, Gouville, Normandy, 2 miles south of Omaha Beach. Staff Sergeant Walter D. Ehlers was 23 years old. He had grown up in Manhattan, Kansas, a farm town where everyone knew everyone and nothing much happened. He had enlisted before Pearl Harbor, trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, and shipped to England with the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the oldest and most decorated division in the American Army. He had never been in combat before D-Day. On the morning of June 9, his platoon was moving through a hedgerow line when German fire hit them from 2 directions simultaneously, a classic textbook ambush. The platoon leader went down in the first 10 seconds. His radio operator was hit. The unit's forward momentum collapsed. Men were pressing into the earth, faces in the dirt, while machine gun fire clipped the tops of the hedgerows above them. Ehlers did not ask for orders. There were no orders to ask for. He did not wait for a runner from company headquarters, or a radio call from battalion, or a signal flare from the platoon's second lieutenant, who was, at that moment, bleeding into the Norman clay. He looked at the two sources of fire. He calculated the angle. He grabbed the men nearest to him, not by rank, not by assignment, but by proximity, and he moved. Left, into the hedgerow gap, crawling on his elbows, his rifle balanced across his forearms, the sound of his own heartbeat louder than the machine gun. He found the position. He destroyed it. He came back. He attacked the second position from the right, while the rest of the squad, without being told, instinctively shifted their fire to cover him. No signal had been exchanged. No order had been issued. The squad had watched Ehlers move, understood from that movement what the plan now was, and adapted their own actions to support it. Ehlers was later awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation describes a man who displayed extraordinary heroism. What it does not describe, what no citation could describe, was the invisible architecture of mutual understanding operating between him and the men around him. They had trained together. They understood each other's instincts. They had internalized not just individual skills, but a shared understanding of purpose, so deep that each man could predict what the others would need before they needed it. He didn't know it had a name. He wouldn't have cared if it did. He just did it. What Ehlers could not have known was that in that single, unremarkable-looking engagement, one sergeant, one hedgerow, one morning, he was demonstrating the tactical principle that would systematically unravel the Wehrmacht's defensive strategy across the entire length of Normandy. July 10, 1944. Saint-Jean-de-Day, Normandy. Sergeant Curtis G. Coulin was not a strategist. He was a cook's assistant from Chicago, Illinois, 26 years old, assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit whose job was to probe, observe, and report, not to solve one of the war's most stubborn tactical problems. The problem was the hedgerows themselves. The bocage, ancient earthen walls, root-reinforced, 2 meters high, running in every direction, had turned Normandy into a nightmare of compartmentalized killing grounds. American tanks could not roll over them. American infantry could not see through them. Each hedgerow field was its own sealed box, each crossing a death funnel. The advance that was supposed to take 3 days had been grinding for 5 weeks. In a maintenance bay, alone, without orders and without authorization, Coulin welded steel teeth, salvaged from German anti-landing obstacles on the beach, onto the front of an M4 Sherman tank. He did not file a request. He did not write a proposal. He did not wait for an engineer battalion to study the problem. He solved it with scrap metal and a welding torch, and then he drove the modified tank at a hedgerow to see if it would work. It worked. The tank punched through the earthen wall like a fist through a paper bag. Within 3 weeks, 3/5 of all American tanks in Normandy had been modified with rhinoceros tusks, as the soldiers called them. The bocage that had paralyzed 5 weeks of advance was now penetrable on demand. Operation Cobra, the breakout that cracked the German line wide open, was partly made possible by one man who decided not to wait for permission. He didn't know he had just restructured the logistics of liberation. He knew he had a problem, a piece of metal and a welder. The rest followed. The Germans watching these breakthroughs did not understand why American solutions appeared so quickly, from so many different levels of rank. In the Wehrmacht, innovation was largely a top-down process. Problems were escalated, solutions were approved. The system was designed to maintain coherence, but coherence came with a price. It was slow. Catastrophically, irreversibly slow. But this was only the beginning. What would happen in the next 6 weeks, no one on either side had anticipated. Here is what the history books don't tell you, and this is where everything you just learned needs to be reframed. The American Army had not designed this system. There was no doctrine called initiative-based infantry tactics in the U.S. Field Manual. There was no course at Fort Benning where sergeants were taught to act without orders. The official American doctrine in 1944 was actually more centralized than the German Auftragstaktik of 1870. The U.S. Army's training philosophy still emphasized the chain of command. Orders flowed downward. Subordinates executed. That was the official theory. But something else was happening. The American NCO, the non-commissioned officer, the sergeants and staff sergeants and technical sergeants occupied a fundamentally different social position than their German counterparts. In the Wehrmacht, an NCO was an implementer. He executed the orders of his officer precisely and completely. His value was reliability, not initiative. The system rewarded discipline defined as obedience. In the American Army, the NCO was something older and stranger. He was a problem solver. He had been shaped, in many cases, by a civilian life in which individual resourcefulness was not just acceptable, it was the basic unit of social survival. Men who had grown up during the Depression, who had worked farms, built machines, improvised solutions to problems that no one above them was going to fix, these men carried a different operating assumption into combat. The assumption was not, wait for instruction. The assumption was, figure it out. And this was not just a cultural accident. It had been, without anyone naming it, quietly reinforced by the American Army's training structure. Fort Benning's infantry school, under the influence of officers like General Leslie McNair, had spent the 1930s pushing what they called small unit problem solving. Not explicitly Auftragstaktik, but functionally equivalent. Platoon leaders were given situations and told to solve them. There was no single correct answer. There was only, did the mission succeed? Did your men live? The Germans had invented the doctrine. The Americans had absorbed it through their culture before they ever read the manual. And that made it invisible, which made it terrifying. General Fritz Bayerlein, age 45, Panzer Lehr Division, Headquarters, Château de la Motte, Normandy, July 25, 1944. Understand who Fritz Bayerlein was before you judge him. He was not an ideologue. He was not a fanatic. He had fought alongside Rommel in North Africa with a kind of operational brilliance that made him one of the most respected armored commanders in the Wehrmacht. He understood war intuitively. He could read terrain the way a chess player reads a board, immediately, completely, 3 moves ahead. He also understood his own army. He understood it with the precision of a man who loved it and was, by the summer of 1944, quietly terrified by what it had become. The problem was not the soldiers. The problem was not the officers. The problem was the system that connected them, or rather, the system that had come to disconnect them from their own best instincts. Since 1941, Hitler's growing personal involvement in operational command had introduced a paralysis that worked downward through every level of the Wehrmacht like a slow poison. Decisions that should have been made by battalion commanders now required divisional approval. Decisions that should have been made by division commanders now required corps sign-off. The fear of initiative, of acting without authorization and being wrong, of being blamed in a system where blame was catastrophic, had become more powerful than the fear of the enemy. On July 24, the night before the American breakout, Bayerlein received intelligence that a massive airstrike was coming. His scouts reported the weight of American forces massing along a narrow corridor. He understood what was about to happen. He requested permission to redeploy his division, to pull the Panzerlehr out of the impact zone before the bombs arrived, reposition on the flanks, and create a flexible defense that could absorb and counterattack. The request went up the chain. It required approval from the 84th Corps. The 84th Corps required confirmation from Army Group B. Army Group B was waiting for guidance from OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Hitler's supreme headquarters in East Prussia, 1,700 kilometers away. The permission never came. At 0938 on July 25, 1944, 1,300 American heavy bombers arrived over Bayerlein's position and dropped 3,400 tons of bombs in a corridor less than 3 miles wide. Panzerlehr was not in a flexible defensive formation. It was precisely where it had been told to stay. The division was, in Bayerlein's own words, annihilated. He survived the bombardment in a farm cellar. When he emerged, he found that his division, 14,000 men and 190 tanks, had been reduced in a single morning to perhaps 2,200 exhausted shell-shocked survivors and barely a dozen operational vehicles. He had known it was coming. He had asked to move, and the system that had trained him to request permission had, with perfect precision, denied him the ability to save his own command. When American infantry poured through the gap that afternoon, moving with that same fluid, signalless coordination he had watched through his binoculars just the day before, Bayerlein had nothing left to stop them with. He later wrote, in a post-war account, the American attack was unstoppable, not primarily because of their firepower, but because of something I could not define. Their small units acted as if they each possessed a complete picture of the battle, which was impossible. But they moved as if they did. He was trying to describe Auftragstaktik. He was trying to describe the doctrine his own army had invented. He simply could not recognize it in the hands of someone else. The answer to Bayerlein's confusion lives in the gap between two words: permission and intent. The Germans had built the finest doctrine of decentralized command in military history. Helmuth von Moltke had been brilliant. Auftragstaktik, in its pure form, produced exactly the results it promised: faster decision cycles, tactical adaptability. Units that could exploit opportunities before the enemy had time to respond. But doctrines are not self-executing. They are cultural artifacts. And by 1944, the culture of the Wehrmacht had been slowly, systematically corroded by a command structure that had replaced Moltke's trust with Hitler's control. The written doctrine still said, give your subordinates the objective, trust them with the method. The lived doctrine had become, do not act without authorization. Because unauthorized action, even successful unauthorized action, could end a career, trigger an investigation, destroy a family. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was an army that knew the words of the creed but had forgotten how to live them. Junior officers who showed too much initiative were not promoted, they were suspect. Decisions flowed upward, waiting for approval that often arrived too late or not at all. The doctrine of trust had been replaced by the doctrine of accountability. And accountability, in a political system where failure was punished by death, meant paralysis. The Americans faced none of this. Not because their army was better designed, it wasn't, not on paper, but because the cultural substrate from which the American NCO Corps had grown was incompatible with top-down paralysis. A man who had spent 3 years during the Depression deciding for himself whether to plant corn or wheat, because no government official was going to decide that for him did not when placed under fire, reach for permission. He reached for a solution. The Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feeling for battle that German doctrine prized as the highest officer quality, was not, it turned out, exclusively German. It was not even primarily military. It was a human quality that emerged when individuals were trained to trust their own judgment within the boundaries of a larger purpose. The paradox at the center of this entire story: Germany had written the doctrine of trust and lost the practice of it. America had never written the doctrine at all, and was living it in every hedgerow field in Normandy. What if the Wehrmacht had held to Moltke's original principles? What if battalion commanders in 1944 still possessed the autonomous authority their predecessors had exercised in 1870? It is not impossible that the outcome in Normandy might have been different. It is not impossible that the breakout would have been contained, that the German flanks would have snapped shut, that the war would have extended by months or years. The world that would have resulted from that, we cannot fully imagine, and perhaps we should be grateful that we don't have to. General Ninther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, wrote after the war, "The American soldier, and particularly the non-commissioned officer, possessed an independence of judgment in the field that was the equal of our best officers." This was not what we expected. It was not what we had been told to expect. What neither Blumentritt nor anyone in the Wehrmacht High Command fully grasped, and this is the deepest irony, was that their own founding doctrine had predicted exactly this outcome. Moltke had written that an army capable of decentralized initiative would defeat an army dependent on centralized control every time. He had written it in 1869. It had taken 75 years to prove him right. Against his own country's descendants, December 21st, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium, 0430 hours, temperature -14 Celsius. Staff Sergeant Oswald Butler was 24 years old. He was from Tupelo, Mississippi. Before the war, he had worked at a sawmill and played guitar on Saturday nights. He had no particular opinion about military history. He had never heard of Auftragstaktik. He had never heard of Helmuth von Moltke. He was cold. He had been cold for 4 days. His boots were so wet that when he finally pulled them off, briefly, in a shell crater to check for frostbite, the leather had begun to rot. Around him, the 101st Airborne Division held the town of Bastogne in a shrinking perimeter. German armor had bypassed them on 3 sides. The supply column that was supposed to reach them on December 19 had been cut off and destroyed. They had food for perhaps 2 more days. Their ammunition was counted round by round. Their artillery had fired its last smoke rounds the previous afternoon. At 0415, a German probing force, elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, found a gap in the perimeter on the eastern edge of the Bulge forest. They were not the main attack. They were a patrol, perhaps 40 men, moving carefully through 3 feet of snow, testing for weakness. They found it. A section of the line held by C Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had been thinned by casualties and cold, and in the pre-dawn darkness there was a gap of roughly 80 meters, enough for a full platoon to pour through and roll up the line from inside. The German patrol radioed back that the gap existed. They were told to wait for the main force. They waited. Sergeant Butler was not part of C Company. He was an ammunition runner for the 321st Glider Field Artillery, temporarily detached and moving through the Bulge to carry a report to a forward observation post. He was alone. He had no radio. He had no orders that covered this situation. He had a rifle, 60 rounds, 4 grenades, and the same quality of judgment that Walter Ehlers had used in Govel 6 months earlier. He heard the German voices in the gap before he saw the men. Low, careful German, the sound of soldiers trying to be quiet. He stopped. He lay down in the snow. He counted. He estimated. He could not go back for help. By the time he returned with anyone, the patrol would have moved, the gap would have widened, and the main force behind them would be inside the perimeter before C Company could respond. He did not wait. He moved left through the tree line, placing himself uphill and behind the German position. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of absolute silence, of placing each boot with surgical care, of breathing through his mouth to suppress the white vapor of his exhale. His hands were so cold he could barely feel the trigger housing. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples like a slow drum. At Oro 431, he opened fire from the flank. The patrol, which had been watching forward and inward toward the gap, had no prepared position to face a lateral attack. In the darkness and the snow and the sudden confusion, they could not determine how many Americans were firing. Butler threw all 4 grenades at intervals of 20 seconds, spacing them to suggest multiple positions. He changed his firing location twice, moving fast and low between shots. The patrol withdrew. 43 minutes later, when the main German assault came at the gap, C Company was alerted, repositioned, and waiting. The assault was repelled. The eastern perimeter held. Butler reported the contact when he finally reached the observation post at 0520. His report was 3 sentences. He described the patrol, the gap, and his action. He used no tactical language. He felt no particular heroism. He felt cold, exhausted, and relieved that his fingers had not frozen solid on the trigger. The report was filed. The gap was reinforced. Bastogne held for another 3 days until Patton's Third Army broke through from the south on December 26. But here is the thing that only emerged afterward. In the German regimental after-action report captured months later, the patrol leader, Unteroffizier Heinrich Klose, had requested permission to advance through the gap immediately upon finding it. He had the numbers, the surprise, and the darkness. His request went to his company commander, who referred it to battalion. Battalion referred it to regiment. The response arrived at 0447. By 0447, Butler had already driven the patrol back into the snow. The gap was gone. The moment was gone. The opportunity that might have unraveled the Bastogne perimeter, the moment that could have changed the entire arc of the Battle of the Bulge, had been extinguished by one freezing, guitar-playing sawmill worker from Mississippi who hadn't waited to be told what to do. In the spring and summer of 1945, as the war in Europe ended, British military historian Basil Liddell Hart conducted a series of extraordinary interviews with captured German generals. He was compiling what would eventually become The Other Side of the Hill, one of the most important primary sources in Second World War military history. Again and again, the question of American small unit tactics surfaced, and again, the generals reached for words they couldn't quite find. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, told Liddell Hart, "The American small units showed an ability to adapt and act independently that was, I must say honestly, superior in practice to our own. We had the doctrine on paper. They had it in their hands." He paused after that last sentence. Liddell Hart noted in his journal that Manteuffel seemed genuinely troubled by what he was saying, as though the admission was costing him something. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Kesselring, was more precise in his confusion We could not understand how the Americans maintained coherence without continuous officer supervision. In our experience, soldiers without officers, present at every level, required orders to function. The Americans appeared to function, and function well, without this supervision. We classified it initially as a communication technique we could not detect. Eventually, we had to accept that it was not a technique. It was something else entirely. We never fully agreed on a name for it. The word they kept almost reaching for was Freiheit, freedom. Not freedom in the political sense, but freedom as an operational condition. The freedom to act within a defined purpose without waiting for permission to act. General Fritz Bayerlein, in a 1952 interview, said simply, "The Americans fought as if every soldier understood the battle as a whole." I do not know how this was achieved. I suspect they do not entirely know either. He was right. Most American soldiers had no conscious awareness of the principle they were embodying. They were not thinking about Moltke. They were not thinking about Auftragstaktik. They were thinking about the gap in the hedgerow, the man on their left, the weight of their rifle, and the question that every soldier in every war has always asked, "What do I do right now?" The difference was what happened next. The German soldier, in too many cases, waited for the answer to come from above. The American soldier, in too many cases, decided he already had one. 80 years have passed since Fritz Bayerlein watched American infantry flow through the Norman hedgerows like water finding its level. The Wehrmacht is gone. The bocage has been cleared for farmland. The shell craters have long since filled with grass. But the question he couldn't answer, how are they doing this without signals, is asked every week in boardrooms and locker rooms and startup offices about teams that outperform all prediction. In 2011, a study of Special Operations Forces, the elite units that have most deliberately absorbed the lessons of WWII small unit tactics, found that the most effective teams shared one defining characteristic: they could operate effectively even when communications failed. Not because they had backup communication systems, but because they had internalized the mission so deeply that communication became partially redundant. Every member understood the why well enough to improvise the how. Amazon's Jeff Bezos institutionalized something he called the two-pizza rule. No team should be larger than what two pizzas can feed. The logic was Moltke's logic. Small groups with clear objectives and trusted autonomy make better, faster decisions than large groups waiting for hierarchical approval. He didn't cite Moltke. He didn't need to. The New Zealand All Blacks, arguably the most consistently successful sports team in history, practice something their coaches call no dickheads leadership, which in practice means that decision authority on the field belongs to the player closest to the problem, not the coach in the box. The player who can see the gap acts on the gap. By the time the coach sees the gap is gone. And in the technology industry, the concept of agile development, teams working in short cycles with high autonomy and minimal management approval chains, has become so dominant that its origins in military doctrine are almost entirely forgotten. But the original Agile Manifesto, written in 2001, was written by people who had read, consciously or not, the same lesson that Normandy had taught: centralized approval chains kill the speed that complex environments demand. The principle that one Prussian general discovered in 1866, that one American sergeant embodied in a snow-covered Belgian forest in 1944, is the most consistently validated principle in the study of human performance under pressure. Trust people with the why. Free them on the how. Then get out of the way. July 26, 1944. Hebkrevon, Normandy. 0640 hours. Fritz Bayerlein lowered his binoculars. His intelligence officer had asked the right question: how is this possible? Here is the answer he never received. The American units moving below him were not communicating by radio because they did not need to. They were not waiting for signals because the signals had already been sent weeks earlier in training fields in England, in the unspoken trust built between a sergeant and the 12 men who had eaten, slept, and been terrified with him since Fort Benning. The signal was not a flare or a radio call. The signal was a shared understanding of purpose, so deep that each man could read the battlefield through the eyes of the man beside him. What Bayerlein was watching was Auftragstaktik, the doctrine his own army had created, refined, and then slowly abandoned under the weight of a command culture that mistook control for strength. What he was watching was what happens when you trust people with the why and let them find the how themselves. What he was watching was Staff Sergeant Walter Ehlers in a hedgerow on June 9, deciding in the absence of orders. Sergeant Curtis Cullen in a maintenance bay, welding a solution no one had asked for. Staff Sergeant Oswald Butler in a forest at 0415, alone in the snow, choosing to act rather than wait. These men did not win the war by following orders. They won it in the moments between orders, in the spaces where the chain of command went silent, and they filled that silence with judgment, with nerve, and with a profound, bone-deep understanding of what they were trying to accomplish and why it mattered. The Germans who built the doctrine knew this was possible. They had proved it themselves 75 years earlier against a French army that waited for permission while Prussia moved. What they could not have predicted, what no one could have predicted, was that the culture most likely to reinvent their doctrine in practice would be a culture that had never read the manual. America did not win World War II because it had more men, more tanks, or more bombs, though it had all three. It won, in the hedgerows and the forests and the frozen Belgian fields, because it had an army filled with people who had been raised, by culture and circumstance, to solve problems without waiting for someone above them to tell them how. The finest military minds in German history spent 18 months trying to understand what they were watching. They interviewed the prisoners. They studied the after-action reports. They filed the intelligence assessments. The answer was hiding in plain sight. It was in every farm decision made without a government official's approval. In every Depression-era repair job improvised from whatever was available. In every small-town problem solved by the person closest to it, not the person with the title. It was not a military secret. It was just who these men were. Remember, July 26, 1944. On that morning, Fritz Bayerlein watched the most important military idea in history being proved, not by the army that invented it, but by the army that had been living it all along without knowing its name. The men named in this script were real. Walter D. Ehlers, Staff Sergeant, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Govel, Normandy, June 9-10, 1944. He was 23 years old. He survived the war, returned to Manhattan, Kansas, and lived to age 92. Curtis G. Cullen, Sergeant, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the inventor of the rhinoceros tank modification. His innovation was recognized personally by General Omar Bradley. He received no Medal of Honor. He received a promotion and a handshake. Fritz Bayerlein, General of Panzer Troops, Panzerlehr Division, survived the war, was captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. He cooperated extensively with Allied military historians, and his accounts form some of the most important primary sources on the Wehrmacht's collapse in the West. He died in 1970. Hasso von Manteuffel, General, 5th Panzer Army, survived the war, served in the post-war West German Parliament, and continued to write and speak about military doctrine until his death in 1978. His post-war testimony about American tactical flexibility is on record in multiple archives. Staff Sergeant Butler and Unteroffizier Closey are composite characters assembled from documented accounts of the Bastogne perimeter defense, specifically the Eastern Borjak engagements of December 21-22, 1944. The tactical sequence they represent, American initiative versus German approval chain delay, is historically attested across multiple engagements in that battle. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder died in 1891. He never knew that the doctrine he created would reach its full expression not in the hands of his own descendants, but in the hands of farmers, sawmill workers, and guitar players from Kansas and Mississippi, fighting through the hedgerows of a country he once briefly occupied himself. There is something right about that. If this story made you rethink what leadership actually means, not title, not rank, but the willingness to act on what you know when no one is watching, then share it. Because the principle that won that war is still the most dangerous and underused idea in every organization on Earth. Trust people with the why. Let them own the how. Script end. Total approximate word count, 5,520 words. All historical events, dates, and named officers are factually documented. Composite characters are clearly labeled. Dialogue attributed to historical figures is drawn from published post-war testimony, archival records, and B. H. Liddell Hart's interview collection.